thanks very much, Melinda, and good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here today. CEDA is such a tremendously important institution. I think this report really gives some critical context and some hard facts and data, and we're business consultants, we like hard facts and data on ongoing debate about the role of business in today's societies. So thank you very much for inviting me. This topic of public trust has really completely captured my interest in the last couple of years. And I'm not going to dwell too much today on the context of why we are, and perhaps thank goodness I decided not to in the light of the 1976 survey, because it looks like maybe nothing's new. But I did just want to reflect at the start of this conversation. I wasn't in Sydney yesterday. I didn't see James Shipton launch his report in relation to how directors are dealing with operational risk. And I didn't hear Elizabeth talk about her psychologist's report about boardroom behaviour. So rather than buy into that debate, I think it's important from my point of view to recognise, I think we all know there's lots to do. But what I wanted to spend some time on today is just give some practical observations perhaps about the many positive things that I think I see and talk to businesses about that are changing and the positive steps people are taking. So I wanted to start just reflecting on the fact that, you know, in my time as chair, which has been about 2 years, I've probably had almost every conversation at some point touches on the topic. And I do feel now that particularly in the last 12 months, I regularly hear directors and business leaders saying that long-term shareholder interests are actually best served when companies act responsibly, when they care for others, when they recognise the complex ecosystem of stakeholders that exists. So I feel that real progress and recognition is occurring, and I see that play out in the day-to-day conversations in the boardrooms. I also thought in opening I'd touch on some of the recent debate there's been, having just spent a couple of days in Canberra, around this issue of corporate activism. And clearly there are some politicians and commentators out there who say corporations shouldn't get involved in social values and they should just stick to their knitting. I personally have a strong view that that just misses how complex everyone's knitting is today. I also think it reflects, a bit of a perhaps lack of recognition of the lag between community expectations and political action. We've had a lot of big things happening in society recently. If I look at what's happened on same-sex marriage, Melinda touched on climate change, on Indigenous recognition. Legislation really only comes when the community has really overwhelming support for an issue. So inevitably the law lags behind community expectations, and I think as the pace of change increases, that lag has and will continue to widen. And so in that position, I think organisations are quite rightly identifying that gap and being prepared to step in and be part of the debate and part of helping with solutions. I want to first start with shareholders. I know, again, there have been a number of critics out in the public saying that companies should only focus on shareholder interests. But I think that again, fails to recognise how the debate on shareholder interest has moved. I look at large institutional shareholders. I know there are a lot of super funds and institutional investors in the audience today. The chairman of Australian Super earlier this week, BlackRock, all of those organisations are out there being very clear that they are not just looking at this year's financial returns. They want to understand how companies are engendering and sustaining the trust of their stakeholder ecosystems for the long term. And from my point of view, it's not just institutional shareholders either. I was fascinated by this research. It's incredibly closely aligned to a publication we put out last month, which was KPMG Acuity. We surveyed 1,500 retail investors to understand what was driving investment decisions by retail shareholders, including mum and dad self-managed super funds. And what we found was that transparency and honesty were prioritised almost as high as shareholder returns. We found that all retail investors are very keenly aware of the importance of reputation, transparency, ethical behaviours, values alignment and social responsibility, and they're making their investment decisions accordingly. So any suggestion that directors don't have clear permission from shareholders to consider the needs of all stakeholders, I think that debate should be largely gone, and I don't see it continuing to play out in directors. Rather than thinking about a neat trade-off between delivering for shareholders and delivering for society, I think people have moved to recognising that there's shared benefit, and that does give a great platform for progress. Perhaps, Melinda, we could see if in 40 years' time we could get it right this time and move the dial. So I think about, so I wanted to talk to you probably about 5 stakeholder groups outside of shareholders that I feel I've seen companies stepping up to and making changes for, and broadly they were all touched on in Melinda's survey. They're customers, employees, suppliers, regulators, and then the overall role of business in the community. So why don't I start with customers and look at how the relationship with customers has shifted? And of course, I can't go past the Hayne Royal Commission in looking at that. Whilst the Hayne Royal Commission was just looking at the financial sector, almost everything he aired applies more broadly across society, and I believe that the conduct of all organisations right across the economy is often informed by some of the things that Hayne said and those findings. I hear that conversation often. I just want to summarise the very basic recommendations he made. First, obey the law, don't mislead or deceive, be fair, provide services that are fit for purpose, deliver services with reasonable care and skill, and when acting for another, act in their best interests. It's hardly rocket science. But I think that has been a suite of tools that I've seen boards have real conversations around to challenge their existing practice and reform. And I'll give you a few examples. Shortly after the Commissioner Hayne brought down his findings, I was talking to a senior executive in the telecommunications industry, and he told me he'd ordered a full line-by-line audit of all customer charges. And then he just went through with a red pen and eliminated those that were a source of pain, distrust for the consumer. Personally, I notice my energy company now sends me a text message to remind me that payment for my bill is due tomorrow, instead of waiting till I miss a bill and issuing me a late notice. And more importantly, between bills, I get monthly statements from the energy company now, highlighting my usage and giving me tips on energy efficiency. So they're actually trying to help me use less of their product. They're foregoing revenue, but they're buying my loyalty and they're rebuilding trust. And the last example on customers I thought I'd share with you was a conversation I had recently with an insurance company who've completely rethought their processes. Traditionally, for home and contents insurance, the onus has been on the applicant to verify building materials, the age of the house, the type, all the details, and we all complete those complex, confusing forms, knowing that we're guessing at best some of the information and terrified that if the answer's wrong, that will be used as an excuse to deny our claim. Well, this company's completely rethought their process. They now ask just 3 simple questions, and from there they use data analytics, online search data and Google Maps to triangulate the value of the property and to price the insurance premium. So the responsibility has shifted away from the consumer and trust is restored. So I feel almost every company has changed the way that they now require customer data to be reported to boards. It's no longer just about headline satisfaction scores in the high 90s. Yes, they might get that, but they also want a real deep dive on the unhappy customers, no matter how small the tail. And they'll look at the vulnerable customers and the forgotten ones and treat them as the canaries in the coal mine to take action. So I think there's been real progress on customers, notwithstanding I know there's still more to do. Second group I wanted to look at briefly was employees. I note the report that Melinda touched on today had some really interesting findings. According to CEDA's report, the number one thing Australians think companies should be focusing on is providing staff with good work-life balance. And I also noticed that when the Australian public were presented with dozens of options for what a company's priorities should be, CEDA found that 4 of their top 10 issues related to improving conditions of employment, including investing in staff wellbeing, training opportunities and improving wages, which is fascinating to look at. And I think it shows that there's still work to be done in meeting community expectations for employees. Perhaps not surprising given we're all spending more and more time at work. So it's vitally important to invest in employee wellbeing, including positive work structures to enable employees to manage stress, mental health, and work-life balance. Again, I've seen some positive examples on which we can all build. One of my clients recently told me about an initiative they've brought in where they're showing leadership right from the top and getting each top team to ask each individual to nominate one thing that's non-negotiable, whether it's soccer training or attendance at assembly, and then the whole team agrees to work around that non-negotiable, cover for each other, or not arrange meetings at that time. And in that way, they're really embedding permission to have flexible work practice right from the top, right through the organisation. And I'm not talking about management, I am talking about site-based physical labourers in this instance, which was fascinating. I've obviously seen other organisations working really hard on agile working, where employees are encouraged to work wherever and whenever it suits them. And the other thing where I think I've seen really strong positive change is the number of organisations that are embracing a range of positive mental health initiatives, including, importantly, making it possible to have those difficult conversations. But on employees, I don't think we should resile from the negatives and the fact that there's still a lot to do. Over the weekend, I read Annabelle Crabb's most recent essay on men at work, and she highlighted that in 1991, Australian families had 4% of households with stay-at-home dads. 25 years later, that statistic, 5%. That's not exactly moving a lot. So whilst some companies are driving new parental leave policies and a range of mechanisms to enable flexible work for all parents, I do think that's an area that should still have a lot of focus. And I'd also like to draw attention to a report that KPMG published on behalf of Diversity Council of Australia last month, again, which gave some updates on the gender pay gap signals. And again, that's another area where the rate of progress is unacceptably slow. The third group of stakeholders I wanted to focus on was suppliers. Again, I noticed the Company Pulse report had their suppliers ranking high in the priority list, with paying small businesses promptly ranked as 8th. Perhaps not surprising when we all understand how embedded in the community small business owners are. But this is an area where I think there are some great tools and some recent advancements. I note with particular interest, perhaps because we've signed up to it, that the Business Council of Australia has now signed 120 companies to its Australian Supplier Payment Code. That code commits to pay eligible Australian small business suppliers on time and within 30 days of receiving a correct invoice, and you only sign up when you're absolutely confident that your systems can enable you to deliver on it. But the likes of Coles, Woolworths, Aldi, BHP, Rio Tinto, and as I said, KPMG are all signed up. And the code's also been signed by many non-business council members, as well as local governments and the state government of Victoria. And I think this is a great example of business collectively recognising a problem and taking hard, practical steps to address it, which really does make a difference to the community. Wanted to touch briefly on regulators. Of course, responsibility for how we run organisations lies with companies, but the trust crisis has also pushed regulators into the spotlight, and recent royal commissions have been as critical of regulators as they have of companies. And by and large, their response has been to toughen up, a renewed focus on litigate or explain why not, and regulators even saying that even if you come forward voluntarily, don't expect us to let you off the hook. From KPMG perspective, we think strong regulators with a really clear statement of intent around how they intend to apply the rules is a good thing, because it gives companies certainty, and we're very comfortable. It's easier for all parties if they know exactly where they stand. And again, we would encourage companies to work constructively with regulators, because those that do generally produce better outcomes. But I do think it's important for us to keep challenging how far they push towards the extremities. And I do watch with concern when regulators push towards zero tolerance. Of course, if you're in airline safety, it's absolutely appropriate to have a zero tolerance for any risk areas. But for most businesses, they're in the business of taking risks. And if we go too far as regulators, we run the risk that businesses will stop taking risks, that they will be unable to access credit, and the growth, which at the end of the day is vital to the things highlighted in CEDA's report, employee confidence and security and community satisfaction, will falter. And the last group I wanted to talk about briefly was just the broader community. As Melinda highlighted, the Company Pulse report found that 78% of the general public want business leaders to speak out on issues of national performance, but only 50% of us people think we're genuine when we're doing it. So my observation is the companies that do this well are the companies that do it when they back it up by meaningful action and commitment, and that doing anything else can do more harm than good to the trust agenda and allegations of virtue signalling, or for those who like new words, I heard the term woke washing for the first time last week, and those issues start to stick. Certainly in a world of social media, we don't believe there's any such thing as confidentiality anymore, so anyone who thinks that they can say one thing publicly and then do another within the organisation is kidding themselves. And apart from social media, my observation would be that the new whistleblower legislation which came into place on 1st of July has also increased the likelihood that such behaviour won't work. So from our point of view at KPMG, we've been very clear that we want to engage in the debate on a range of social issues, but we'll only do so either where we're absolutely confident we either can or have backed up our words with action, or where we have meaningful research or expertise that can contribute to an informed debate. For example, we do speak up on Indigenous issues because our views are informed by long and deep engagement on a range of initiatives, including procurement, secondments to remote communities, employment, and investing in our own Indigenous consulting business. So Melinda, I wanted to probably wrap up there. I hope I've given people some ideas of things that they can do to positively move towards it again, to positively move things forward. Despite what you do see and hear, and I know we're all being encouraged to do more, I do believe that people are taking this seriously, having different conversations in the boardrooms and taking great steps, and so I hope that that will continue. From our point of view, the companies that are doing it well are the ones that have started at the top in those boardroom conversations. They recognise it's strategic and major. It's not about grand gestures or big announcements. It's actually about building up, brick by brick, the jobs. And the last thing I'd want to say, and interesting that I'd made this note, Melinda, not knowing you were going to refer to that old report, is I don't think this is a task that will ever be done. I think society's expectations will continue to evolve, and so companies will have to continue to evolve with them, and I have no doubt that there'll continue to be lots of people telling you how to do it along the way. But for what it's worth, in my view, the organisations that are focused on their culture are continuously listening to all their stakeholders and are deeply authentic in the way they go about their business will be the ones that survive and thrive. And I might let us eat now, and then we'll come back and get some more thoughts from the panel on what we found in the survey. Thank you very much.